Is Chinese a relevant world language? To quote the Buddha, whatever has the nature of arising has the nature of ceasing. Or, in other words, everything changes and there's nothing we can do about that, whether we want to or not. I have argued elsewhere that the notion of claiming Chinese or any other language to be the oldest language in the world is pure nonsense, for the reason that everything changes. A modern citizen of Shanghai or Taipei would hardly be able to understand a speaker of 1st century BCE Old Chinese. This was way before the tones developed, and there were many sounds aloud that modern speakers would struggle to pronounce. I'd wager that even Middle Chinese from 1,000 years ago would be more or less unintelligible to most modern Chinese people without specialized training in that specific subject. What's true about the change of languages is also true for everything else. From what I understand, when we ask how old a country is, we run into similar problems to what we would when we ask how old a language is. Because everything changes. What starts off as a confederacy unifies into a state, breaks up through civil war, unifies as new countries, which then get invaded by a larger empire, breaks away when that empire falls, and so on. Even if what comes out on the other side calls itself the same name as that original state, is it the same? However we define these things, China, in one form or the other, has been around for at least 3,000 years. For most of its history, China didn't call itself Zhongguo, instead it defined itself by the name of the dynasty ruling at the time. The earliest such name mentioned is Xia, followed by Shang in the 2nd millennium BCE. Even though the reality is much more complex, we can, in this manner, very crudely, describe the history of China as a string of dynasties, one giving way to another, all the way up to the formation of the modern Chinese state. The history of the Chinese language is not as linear as the history of China, since it's easier that languages get broken up into distinct dialects without getting reunified. Historical linguists have worked tirelessly on the Herculean feat to piece together the history of the Chinese language family. A full description of this fascinating story will require a video series of its own. An overview can look something like this. From the Chinese state's point of view, they have solved this problem by consolidating the writing system, so the speakers of otherwise mutually intelligible Chinese dialects can understand each other in writing. In fact, the prestige variety we today call classical Chinese was a written and not a spoken standard. More on that later. Just listing the current dialects and varieties of Chinese turns out to be a time consuming and difficult project. Different censuses routinely turn out hundreds of local varieties. I'll do my best to be brief. In that spirit, these are the major Chinese dialects spoken today. 普通话 Standard Mandarin, Beijing dialect. 粤语 Cantonese. 闽语 Hokkien, Taiwanese. 吴语 Shanghainese. Hui Yu, Hui, sometimes classified as Mandarin, Wu, or even Gan. Kejia Hakka, spoken by a significant number of Taiwanese natives. Xiangyu, Xiang, Hunanese, spoken by Mao Zedong. Jinyu, Jin, sometimes considered to be a dialect of Mandarin. Ganyu, Gan, sometimes classified as a variety of Hakka. Tracing and disentangling these many threads in the myriad of Chinese languages is a fascinating topic. It does, however, lie beyond the scope of this video. For most foreigners, learning Chinese will equal learning Mandarin, although, of course, many also choose to learn other dialects. For the sake of simplicity and brevity, however, I will, as far as I can, limit myself to mainly discussing Mandarin from now on. In order to understand the recent history and future of Mandarin, we need to first look at its historical and modern settings. So, we have seen that change is inevitable, and that the sinosphere in the Chinese languages have been changing continuously over the last 3 millennia, and it hasn't stopped. Just like any other countries or languages, the modern states of the People's Republic of China, or Zhonghua Renmin Gongheguo, and the Republic of China, Zhonghua Minguo, or Taiwan, have not been frozen in time. Instead, this part of the world has evolved over the past 4 millennia, going from a regionally small settlement with maybe a couple of million people to the modern Chinese state covering around 9.5 million square kilometers and with a population of around 1.4 billion. Lingua francas have existed in what is today modern China since at least the 8th century BCE. The variety of that era is called Guwen, which means ancient text, or Wenyan, meaning text language, and is usually translated to classical Chinese. This was not a spoken standard but a written one, which allowed for unification in writing even amid several mutually unintelligible spoken varieties. Confucius, born in the mid 6th century BCE, reportedly spoke Yayan, elegant speech, the prestige standard spoken by the elite at that time. It was in the Ming Dynasty, founded in the 1300s, when the name Guanhua, bureaucrat speech, began to be used. This was later translated by the Portuguese into Mandarin, that is, Mandarin. The term Putonghua, or Modern Standard Mandarin, was officially coined by the People's Republic of China in 1955 after the Civil War, and marks a name change from the earlier Guoyu, a name that is still used in Taiwan to refer to the standard dialect of Taiwanese Chinese. Putonghua is based on the variety spoken in Beijing and Guoyu on the variety spoken in Taipei. Foreigners, that is, non Chinese, or speakers of other languages than Chinese, have been living in China for millennia. Some even conquered China, became emperors, and established dynasties, ruling China for centuries. It stands to reason that some, but certainly not all of them, learned to speak Chinese. These were mostly, if not exclusively, foreigners that lived in areas with contiguous land borders to China, like the Mongols and the Manchus. As for more distant foreigners, Africans have had long contact with the Chinese, with trade routes established between the East African city-states and China in the 900s, allowing Africans to travel to China to trade and to study. Probably at least some of them learned the local language. Even the continent farthest from East Asia, South America, has been in contact with China since at least the 1600s, when connections were established across the Pacific Ocean between Mexico and China, going via the Philippines. As for Europe, the Roman Empire established contact with China already in the 2nd century CE, with Roman diplomats reaching China in the 2nd and 3rd century. More recently, some number of Europeans have been living in China since at least the 13th century, engaging in trade and missionary work during the era of Pax Mongolica, from the beginning of the 1200s to the mid 1300s. One of these European travelers was Marco Polo, who was the quintessential travel blogger of his time. But as far as we know, he never learned to speak Chinese. The historical interest among international foreigners who lived far away from China to learn the Chinese language has been low. This is not surprising, given that most of the world's 7,000 languages never gained this kind of attention at all, with a few notable exceptions like Arabic, English, and Spanish, and very recently, Chinese. Just the last 4 decades has seen enormous changes in Chinese society. China's wealth has grown from 7 trillion in 2000 to 120 trillion in 2020. 800 million people have been brought out of poverty according to the World Bank, although some are skeptical. An illustration of this is urbanization. According to the administrative divisions of China, there are now 687 cities in China, not including Taiwan, out of which 409 have a population of over 100,000 people. And while in 1980 only 19% of the population lived in cities, by 2021 this was up to 63%. This rapid urbanization could happen because China is building cities at a record speed, with 600 new cities having been built since the 1950s. In fact, nearly all of modern urban China was built during the last 30 years, with Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou being exceptions to the rule. One contributing factor for this massive urbanization is the fact that there are simply many more Chinese citizens around today than before the 1911 revolution that overthrew the last emperor. The Chinese population has exploded over the last century from around 450 million in 1900 to around 1.4 billion today, almost a tripling. Or even more strikingly, from around 540 million in 1949 to just shy of a billion in 1980. Even though the Chinese economy has grown impressively over the last century, it didn't really take off until the 1990s. And among growing fears of overpopulation, the supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping, implemented a strictly enforced birth control policy in 1982, the one child policy. I'll discuss some of the consequences of these massive undertakings in a little while. China's recent increase in power, if not prestige, on the world scene has prompted many foreigners to choose to study Mandarin. Good numbers are hard to come by, but one metric is that 750,000 people took the HSK Chinese proficiency test in 2010, compared to roughly 116,000 in 2005. During the same period, the number of foreign students in China went up from 36,000 to 240,000. And according to the Chinese Ministry of Education, there are currently 25 million foreigners learning Chinese. The exact number of students is irrelevant. The point is that Chinese as a foreign language has been trending upwards for the last 20 odd years. This can be compared to the number of Chinese students to the USA, which peaked at 372,000 before the pandemic and is currently reported to be 317,000. As for English in China, the numbers vary wildly between 10 million and 300 million, with the former group sometimes said to be speakers and the latter said to be learners. Again, the exact numbers are somewhat irrelevant when we consider that, however we look at it, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people fall somewhere on the Chinese English bilingual spectrum. This is important since this is how language pairs influence each other in the minds of people who speak both. So, we've seen that the interest from foreigners to learn Chinese has grown over the last 2 decades, and likewise, the interest from Chinese people to learn English is high. What is the future of this mutual interest and linguistic exchange? To answer that, let's first have a look at the Chinese state over the past decade. Xi Jinping took control of the Communist Party and of China when he became General Secretary of the CCP in 2012 and then President of China in 2013. After ascending to power, he quickly launched a far reaching anti corruption campaign that ended up affecting over 1 million officials and removing thousands, both high and low, including many of Xi's political rivals. With any real rivals out of the way, Xi didn't spare any time in consolidating power to himself. Following this, Xi swiftly started developing a more assertive and even belligerent Chinese international stance. During this time, China left its former foreign policy motto, 韬光养晦, to conceal one's light and bide one's time, to the more aggressive 蟑螂外交, wolf warrior style diplomacy. This new style has been characterized, for example, by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian's provocations against Australia on Twitter and former Chinese ambassador to Sweden Gui Chongyou's many threats against journalists. For the past several decades, China has been the economic wonder of the world. I already mentioned some of the remarkable accomplishments pulled off by China during this period. The world looked with amazement at the speed with which China built a vast high speed train network, houses, and entire new cities. China was already getting richer and at a breakneck speed at that. At the same time, the childbirth policies seemed to have worked, and the Chinese population started to plateau at the still massive 1.2 billion people. A plateauing population in combination with a booming economy meant that the Chinese people was getting richer, and just like the Japanese before them, wealthy Chinese tourists were soon everywhere, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying the most modern cameras. But there were cracks starting to appear. The aforementioned influx of people to urban areas means that the cities, as well as the countryside, are changing rapidly. As skilled workers migrate to the higher salaries in the cities, hundreds of villages are left empty, or at least bereft of their most productive young workforce. Building entire new cities from scratch on a massive scale is often extremely profitable at the onset, but may as time goes by become increasingly problematic. In China, real estate constitutes 29% of GDP. However, 20% of buildings stand empty. This translates to around 65 million vacant properties and has resulted in a situation where entire sections of these ghost cities remain entirely unpopulated. As far as I understand it, real estate has been key in increasing China's wealth, and the Chinese people has been incentivized to invest in it. The real estate market has been steadily growing, prompting people who already own homes to buy property anyway, and so the bubble kept growing. How will this seemingly impending housing bubble develop? Only the future can tell. As for the one child policy, when Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping implemented it in 1982, it was born out of a legitimate concern for overpopulation. However, the measures might have been unnecessary. Whatever would have happened or could have happened, we don't know. What we do know is that China, alongside many countries in the West, is facing huge demographic challenges due to a rapidly aging population. In other words, China's population pyramid is becoming increasingly top heavy. 40 million are expected to retire over the upcoming 3 years, while the working age population will shrink by 35 million during the same time period. This may have dire consequences for the future of the Chinese economy. We have previously seen that tens of millions of non Chinese are currently learning Mandarin, and that likewise, tens of millions of Chinese are learning English. I am being conservative. The true numbers, depending on how we count, might be in the hundreds of millions in both cases. So, how will the current state of affairs affect Chinese as a language that the rest of the world will want to learn? As I see it, there are three main factors influencing you to learn a new language. These are because it's cool, it's good for business, it's for my family. Is China cool? I am old enough, barely, to remember when Japan became cool. Around the year 2000, Tamagotchis and Pokemons were suddenly everywhere, and almost overnight, all my older friends were learning Japanese. The question is China cool today, like Japan was and still is cool? And if it is, how will this perceived coolness be affected by the above mentioned change of international rhetoric to a more belligerent and rude tone, not to mention the recent growing international attention to the unrest and crackdowns in areas like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the growing threats of military violence in Taiwan? I don't know, but I imagine this PR cannot be good. Likewise, will the demographic and real estate crises facing China affect the way foreign investors look upon the country? If business opportunities on the Chinese mainland are perceived to diminish, less foreigners could be incentivized to study Mandarin, but it's too early to tell. As for family reasons, if you come from a Chinese speaking family background, that's not dependent on whatever happens politically, socially, economically, demographically, or culturally in China or anywhere else. If your loved ones speak Mandarin, chances are you will be more likely to do so too. And that's not going to change. Additionally, what we're looking for apart from foreigners' interest to learn Mandarin are the opportunities that exist for language and cultural exchange. Because no matter how cool China is, and no matter how attractive its markets are to foreign investors, these factors don't matter much if the opportunities to get into China for educational or business reasons dwindle or grind to a halt. I'm writing this in May of 2022, and just during the last 6 months, this is exactly what we have seen happening. This is largely but not only because of Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. While the rest of the world has, at least grudgingly, accepted a world in which we all have to learn to live with COVID 19, China has not. As of April 2022, only a handful of foreign students are allowed to enter China, and international students who were previously studying in China are finding it difficult or impossible to return. Further, as of May 2022, up to 400 million Chinese citizens are under strict government enforced lockdowns in 45 cities across China. These lockdowns have wreaked havoc on the daily lives of people in Shanghai and of Hong Kong, which have recently been forcibly incorporated into the Chinese mainland. In a recent survey targeted at expatriates, 850 out of 1,000 respondents said that they were considering leaving China due to their experiences of the lockdown. Of course, saying is one thing and doing is another, and 1,000 people is not statistically significant. Only time can tell how this story will actually unfold. Perhaps more damningly, Jörg Wuttke, president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, said that 50% of European immigrants to China had left since the start of the pandemic, and that he wouldn't be surprised if the other half left. But again, so far, this is speculation. As for the economy, Reuters report an outflow of foreign investment out of China, but the CCP via the Global Times would beg to differ. As for what this will mean for the future of the Sinosphere, there are as many guesses as there are experts or YouTube channels, so I'm not gonna commit to any one of them. What if China launches an invasion of Taiwan amidst its aforementioned deteriorating relations with the West? There has been a renewed support for Taiwan from some major Western countries lately, including the USA, which has the by far strongest navy in existence. What will the consequences of all of this be? Here are two alternatives. Over the last 2 months, some voices have been expressing hope that China will watch the protracted war in Ukraine in combination with a surprisingly unified Western response and learn the lesson that invading Taiwan is probably a bad idea in the near future. There is, however, no way we can know what the CCP is really thinking, and it might be learning the very opposite lesson, namely that creating an external common enemy is an effective way to galvanize its population and create social unity during a time of great economic and pandemic hardship. Only the future can tell, but what we can already see is that international relations between China and the West are getting frostier. What does this mean for the future of Mandarin Chinese and its role internationally? Whether we are focusing on the future of the status of Chinese as an attractive foreign language or on the development of the Chinese language itself as it comes into contact with other languages, I think we shouldn't be too quick to draw conclusions based on the current political situation. Compared to politicians who need to respond quickly to a rapidly changing world, languages prefer to take their time. If you're interested in the Chinese language as purely economical in nature and waxes in ways in concordance with the volume of foreign investment into China, then you might not be watching this. But even if you are, you will know that there will still be ample opportunities within the Sinosphere during the foreseeable future. And of course, if your interest in Mandarin is anything to do with friends, romantic partners, family, culture, and history, and unless China launches a war against Taiwan, you have nothing to worry about. Your loved ones will be there for you, and Chinese culture and traditions will be as rich as always. For now. Ling Spark, I'm Saul and thank you for watching. If you like this, then like and subscribe. See you in the next video.